Welcome to our podcast, exploring the relationship between technology and conservation. In this episode, we're excited to bring to you an interview with Professor Bill Adams, a renowned expert in conservation and development, conducted by Grusha Victor. Professor Adams is the Claudius Segre Chair of Conservation and Development at the Geneva Graduate Institute and was previously the Moran Professor of Conservation and Development at the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge. He has published extensively on conservation, including the books Against Extinction, The Story of Conservation, and Green Development, Environment and Sustainability in a Developing World. Join us as we explore how new technologies are reshaping our understanding of nature and conservation practices with one of the leading voices in the field.
Hello, Professor Adams. Would you like to tell about the work that you've done and what is likely the field of digital technologies in nature conservation?
Thank you very much. Yes, so most of my work in the digital field has been around digital tracking of animals and what that means for conservation. So there are these very small digital devices that can be attached to animals or birds and enable them to be followed. And then you can work out where they go, and you can work out also sort of what happens to them. And that technology, those technologies are transforming the way conservation is planned, and that's what interests me. I'm not really a technologies person, but I'm interested in the way technology is used and the way it changes conservation.
And how do you think these technologies can be used for greater collaboration and knowledge sharing among not just conservationists but also different stakeholders?
I think the digital technologies both introduce new things and they adapt old things. So in that case, that kind of tracking technology enables scientists to understand more about where elephants go and how they operate in a landscape that's shared with people. But that knowledge was already there. It's just there's more intensity, more detail, more specificity because of the digital. And the same is true, I think, of media technologies like social media. Because they're there and because they're being used in everyday life, they find their way into conservation.
Right. And do you think these technologies for conservation can help towards issues of environmental justice and promote more equitable conservation practices?
You're thinking about sort of social media and that sort of thing?
Yes.
Yes, they can. They don't necessarily do so, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it's obvious that social media enables people to organise, and therefore, if for example you have a situation where conservation is making demands on local communities, which that community resents or wants to change, it can help them to organise in order to find common interests and to present a common position. So that's the classic sort of Arab Spring argument that these technologies help democracy and help the search for justice. It is, of course, equally true that the same technologies can be used by the oppressing organisation, the government, or whatever it is. So it's not a clear win for either side.
Yeah, I feel there's not a clear picture to a viewer or a user, social media user, who's not really aware of the depth of the issue. And so that propaganda from different sides, for example, from lobbyists and then conservation people who conserve nature, it just kind of not sit well, and people can't make the right choices at times. Because, of course, social media is a place where things are presented in a certain way, which is supposed to appeal to you, supposed to, and all the visuals and everything. So, yeah.
Yeah, so, you can, I suppose you can sell conservation the same way as you can sell breakfast cereal using social media. And in a way, in a world where everything is sold through social media, it's important to have conservation represented there. So it makes a new arena for all the usual sorts of outreach. The interesting question, I think, in the developing world is what access people have to these technologies, because we're very used to thinking in, say, in Europe, where that everybody has them, although it's not true here either, because certain sections of the community don't. Like old people tend not to be as linked up as younger people. But in the developing world, you know, the reach of these technologies, you know, is not universal, and therefore is interesting questions as to how to use them positively for better communication between conservation agencies and local people.
Yeah, and also losing touch of what is actually happening in real at those places. I think that can create amount of pressure which might not be valid. Maybe the local government in a place is trying something, but then there's also a pressure from, you know, online groups. So I think there's still that a lot of grey area in how it can address or not.
Yes, it's true. I mean, we did an interesting project in northern Kenya where one of the difficulties with elephants crop breeding. Elephants basically love to eat crops like maize. I mean, it's sweet and delicious. So they break in and they do a lot of damage. One of the things that caused resentment among farmers was not just that they did it, but the fact that they couldn't get the wildlife department to turn out to scare the elephants off. And so one of the things we did was using SMS messaging created an SMS messaging network which got them straight through to the game guards and also to the game guards' superior officers. So it was obvious that the message had got through, and it was also obvious if they hadn't responded. And that helped to improve the kind of relations on the ground, which was useful. But the other thing you mentioned, which is sort of the way social media creates these kind of storms of concern, is really interesting, because you do get these differences between, well, you get, for example, people have very strong views in North America or Europe, perhaps about issues like hunting, and so you get a sort of a strong sort of social media storm about hunting. And locally, perhaps in Africa, where I've done a lot of work, people have very different views about those things, but they don't tend to get featured on the social media because there's not so many users.
Moving on from that, so do you see the relationship between these new digital technologies for conservation and traditional practices? How does it evolve in the future, and what are some of the implications of this shift?
Yes, I'm not sure that that digital media technologies are transformative. I don't think they change anything. It creates a different arena for groups to communicate with each other. There are lots of things that are now done digitally. All mapping is very digital, information gathering is very digital, and a lot of communication is now sort of through social media or through websites rather than books and posters and so on. But a lot of it still needs to be designed and presented and animated, and actually traditional forms of communication about conservation are still really effective. In Kenya we had a local drama group that wrote a play about human-elephant conflict, which went around schools and communities and was very successful. And it was very old school. It was sort of people, dressing up in elephant costumes and playing drunk men and cuckolded women. And it was a great sort of traditional form of certainly not a digital. There was nothing digital about it. It was very analog, if you like. So I think actually conservation has not yet been changed by digital technologies. I think it's just gained a new way of doing some things, but most of the skills and most of the challenges are the same ones we're familiar with.
Right, it's an additional tool.
It's a different additional tool, but it's also an additional responsibility. I mean, quite a lot of money now has to be spent by conservation organisations maintaining their digital profile. They've got to put information out, they've got to sort of speak to their supporters, and that's expensive actually. So in some ways it's not as it's an illusion to think that going digital makes things cheaper, for example. I don't think it does, any more than it does in a university. You just have to employ people to do different sorts of jobs.
Right. And do you think there are any potential downsides or risk associated with relying on digital technologies for conservation efforts? And if so, how do you think we can mitigate those risks?
I think the biggest unrecognised problem is the sort of ecological or environmental impact of digital technologies. It's easy to assume that they don't have an environmental impact because something that is on a website is not printed on paper, and therefore you haven't had to cut down a tree to make the paper. But of course, every digital device contains all kinds of rare materials that have to be mined, and much of that mining is taking place in areas of conservation value and concern, and they all consume vast amounts of electricity. So in a sense, I think I'd like to see conservation being a little more sceptical about the endless sort of use of the digital, because I just don't think any of us have got a handle on the resource implications of it. I mean, we now understand the resource implications of private car transport and air flights and food. People have some understanding that what we do as standard is probably going to have to change. I don't see that with mobile phones or computers, other devices. If anything, we're galloping further and further in that direction and demanding that more and more people become equipped, not just with a device, but with the latest device. 3G, 4G, 5G, all of it very demanding. So I would like to see conservation being a little more environmentalist about some of these things, instead of just assuming that people will download cute rhino videos and support conservation as a result.
Right, but are there, and I'm not aware of it, but are there any code of conduct or ethics like that are being developed on how to use these technologies, if you would be aware of any such thing?
I don't think so. There are, of course, movements for the refurbishment of technologies, and there's the kind of right to repair movement that wants to see us using workable technologies rather than the latest consumer device. But they're very alternative, and they're not yet particularly strong within the wildlife conservation movement itself. I think it will come as that movement engages more completely with the climate change debate, particularly around carbon and tree planting and so on. I was looking at the website of an organisation called 8 Million Trees, which is basically a tree planting organisation, I suppose, and they had some quite hard-hitting data on how much the use of digital devices costs in energy terms and therefore in CO2 terms. Of course, if you can imagine a world where we've shifted to non-carbon energy sources, then these things get a bit easier. But you've still got the problem that the rare earths and being dug out of Central African national parks, and that's a problem for conservation, and it needs to get serious about it, I think.
Right. Also while we're talking about the scope and risks and everything, I can't help but wonder about the future. And how do you see the use of these technologies changing the way we approach conservation, education, and outreach? And what are some of the challenges associated with communicating complex scientific concepts through these mediums?
Interesting. I mean, I think that we know a lot about how to communicate using social media, using sort of web-based sources. Although we can, we can't communicate in great depth. So I think the difficulty is to go beyond the soundbite, go beyond the sort of cute cat video to something more profound. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how knowledge exchange and knowledge storage works with ChatGPT and other AI-based systems. Gone is the time when, if you wanted to know something complicated, you found an expert and dug them out, probably from some dusty university somewhere, and they knew everything. That doesn't happen anymore. So, and libraries are a bit of an endangered species as storers of books. So I think it's a very interesting question for conservation. I think social media and new devices, mobile devices, are really good at some kinds of things. They're really good at actually potentially at complex debate situations. They're very good at alerting people to the existence of a problem. Whether they give you enough knowledge to start to solve it, I'm more sceptical. But they're certainly a great device for getting everybody onto the same page in terms of understanding the challenge. We've done that with climate. We do understand the challenge, just that it's going to be so painful to do something about it that we're reluctant to take the action. And we, the governments, businesses, citizens, we quail from the prospect, both of the impacts of climate change and from the challenge of seriously dealing with it. So I think the communication of the problem has been very effective, but it doesn't solve the problem.
Right. Just today, I think there were 2 very important sessions by AI for Good. They had one session on how the student-teacher relationship is changing because of ChatGPT, because of AI, and how now AI is also managing and processing the wildlife conservation cameras. They are, so it's quite strange to see how both these things, which are extremely important in terms of research and looking into and studying into nature conservation, are being processed and managed by artificial intelligence. Do you feel like, of course, everything has its own biases and pros and cons, but how would AI do in this term?
So, I think everybody says that the problem with AI is you don't quite know how the algorithm works. And so you use it without really understanding it. And we do that with lots of technologies. People don't know how car engines work. They just expect to switch them on. And it's certainly true of mobile phones and computers. We know how the operating interface works. We don't quite know what's happening behind the scenes. But I assume we'll get better at that. I assume that we will demand and will eventually get something which will explain to us or will test how the algorithms work. So we'll get away from some of the biases that are known to exist in sort of algorithms based on sort of ethnicity or age or whatever. I suppose that'll get better if enough fuss is made. Within conservation so far, I think it's mostly sort of science-based work, a lot of programming and automation. For example, you can use you can automatically identify if you take pictures with a wildlife a trail camera of tigers, then you can use AI to help you identify the individual from the stripe pattern, or you can identify the difference between a tiger and some other large cat automatically, and then it just flags up the images you need to look at. And that kind of thing's really useful for a scientist who might have 50 cameras or 100 cameras for 100 nights, and that's an awful lot of images to look at. So that sort of thing's really, really clever. And I'm assuming that we'll get more used to these kinds of things and get better at interpreting them and know when to not trust them.
Right. And I might sound like a broken record, but then I continuously keep jumping back to this ethical note of technologies, because anything that I guess most of us who are not really well aware of these technologies or haven't done much research into it would be skeptical about it. So the last question that I have for you today is, could you discuss some of the ethical considerations associated with using digital technologies to engage with environmental issues? And how can we ensure that these technologies are used in responsible and sustainable ways?
Well, that's a good question, a big question. I suppose an obvious question is access to technology and access to data, both of which I think are really important. So where these technologies exist and where they're in use, it's really important that different groups engaging have access to the technology and are equipped to analyze it. So, digital mapping is all very well, but if you're planning a new protected area, it's important that the people who live in the protected area can also use the digital mapping and perhaps make a map to show you why your proposals are really, really unhelpful. And that often doesn't happen. So I think that's a really key question. And where people are using algorithms and automation, having some kind of transparency about how those decisions are made. And making sure the people who are using the AI understand how they work and haven't just pulled something inappropriate off the shelf. So I think those are the main things. It's about access to technology. There are ethics around other things, ethics around animal welfare, for example. If you're sticking electric boxes to animals, that's not a neutral thing to do, and it's important that operates within ethical guidelines. And I think there's good practices about all kinds of technology use, good practices around the use of camera traps taking pictures of people and surveillance and that kind of thing. And it's gradually these things are being teased out and written down, and they're usually pretty obvious, but they are helpful to get them sorted out.
Right. Thank you so much for answering all those questions. But before we close this up, would you like to say something about how you feel about it, your concerns, and the way forward that you see with these technologies?
Yes, I think that my main concern about sort of social media and that kind of technology is it's partly about the way in which we now know they can be operated and biased. We've seen that in the political sphere. The way in which they create a kind of discourse which is very destructive, very aggressive. They encourage people to say things online which they would never say in person. And so I think we do have a problem there. I think that's a real difficulty. And the second thing I think is doing something about the endless churn of change, so that we don't throw away so many of the devices, and we actually get some kind of stability in the market. And of course, that's not in the interest of the people who sell us phones and computers and everything else. They have no interest in doing that, but they need to be persuaded to do so. We need to be able to take phones apart and repair them and put them back together again and expect to use them for 10 or 15 years. Why not? So I'd like to see much more sustainability built into the devices and much more accessibility built into the algorithms.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Adams.
Thank you for joining us for this episode, featuring an insightful conversation with Professor Bill Adams. As we have heard, technology has the potential to play a transformative role in the biodiversity conservation, but it is important that we approach it with caution and critical reflection to avoid any potential negative impacts. We hope this episode has provided valuable insights into the complex relationship between technology and conservation. We encourage you to continue exploring this topic and to stay engaged with the latest developments in the field. Thank you for listening.